So here we're going to talk about the various forms of natural selection, or the mechanisms of evolution. When the field of biology was emerging, biologists categorized organisms according to a medieval hierarchy called the Scala Naturae, also known as the Great Chain of Being. This was a hierarchical linear structure thought to be decreed by God that explains the natural order of things, and it was arranged in an increasing order of perfection. The chain starts at the top with God and progresses downward to angels, humans, animals, plants, and then minerals and other non-living things. Of course, as we learned more about natural selection and evolution, we realized that things aren't ordered exactly in this way. One of the main things that happened to change the thought patterns of people during this time was the discovery of fossils. So starting around 1705, people started finding these massive teeth, the size of a man's fist, and other bones, including things like tusks. This so-called tooth of a giant and other bones belonged to the mammoth and mastodon. And at the time, people didn't know anything about mammoths or mastodons, and they in fact thought it was probably from an elephant. But these fossils were collected in North America, and it was Georges Cuvier who proved that this wasn't an elephant and that this animal was an animal that no longer existed. It was an American mastodon, and this was a major blow to the existing idea of the Great Chain of Being, because under the rules of the Great Chain of Being, nature was never allowed a race of animals to become extinct. In fact, Thomas Jefferson famously denied the extinction of mammoths. Georges Cuvier also demonstrated that African and Indian elephants are distinct species, and he confirmed that these fossilized bones from mastodons were from a distinct species that no longer existed. So Cuvier was the first person to provide proof that extinction occurred. But historically, extinction was thought to be impossible under this idea of the Great Chain of Being. And in the 1790s, Cuvier proved that they could go extinct. He was an expert in skeletal anatomy, and he conducted detailed comparisons of fossil animals with currently living animals to prove the idea of extinction. So evolutionary change occurs via processes that can change allele frequencies between generations. And the mechanisms by which this happens are natural selection, and within that we have sexual selection, genetic drift, gene flow, and mutation. But natural selection is the only mechanism that causes adaptive evolution because it is selecting for advantageous traits. These other three mechanisms are non-adaptive, but they also cause a change in allele frequencies and therefore result in evolution. So Charles Darwin had the idea of evolution for quite a while before he published it. But what really prompted him to publish his ideas was a letter that he received from Alfred Russel Wallace, talking about the idea of evolution by natural selection. And Darwin concluded that this preservation of favorable variations and the rejection of injurious variations I call natural selection. There are three conditions for natural selection. The first is you have to have variation. So phenotypic traits vary among individuals. So there has to be genetic variation that allows for phenotypic traits such that natural selection can work on those phenotypic traits. There also has to be differences in fitness, so differences in the survival and reproduction. So these traits will confer a different rate of survival and reproduction to individuals. And the traits have to be heritable. They have to be able to be passed from one generation to the next, so from parent to offspring. So natural selection is an inescapable conclusion if a population has variation in traits among individuals, there's a relationship between the traits and the survival and reproduction of the individual, and the variation can be inherited. So if those three things occur, then the variants that are best suited for growth and reproduction in any given environment will then contribute disproportionately to the next generation. So this first step is that evolutionary change requires variation, and in this example we see that the plants vary in their flower color. And let's assume that the pollinators have an innate preference for one color over the others. So the second thing is that variation must affect fitness. So let's say in our example that the red flowers are half as likely to be pollinated. So for evolution to occur, or at least for evolution to occur via natural selection, the different phenotypes need to affect the fitness of the plants. For example, bees don't see the color red very well. Their form of color vision doesn't extend into the longer wavelengths of the visible light spectrum, and so red is not a high contrast color for them in the same way it is for us. So let's imagine then that the bees tend to avoid plants with red flowers. Those plants will have fewer matings with other plants in the population. And remember that fitness is a measure of the extent to which an individual's genotype is represented in the next generation. So evolutionary change is simply a change in the frequencies of gene variants from one generation to the next. So variation in flower color must be heritable and have a genetic basis. In this example, and the one we will return to again later, there is a gene C that controls flower color. The gene has two variants or alleles. One allele codes for red flower color, that's the R allele, and the other codes for white flower color, the W allele. Plants that are homozygous for the R allele have red flowers, and plants that are homozygous for the W allele have white flowers. Plants that are heterozygous and have one copy of each allele have pink flowers. So in this example, the gene for flower color has two alleles with incomplete dominance. So in this example, if steps 1, 2, and 3 that we talked about are true, then evolution will occur. So the red flowers are half as likely to be pollinated, and so in the second generation we get a different phenotypic ratio and genotypic ratio. And again, if they're again half as likely to be pollinated, we see a shift again in the allele frequencies, simply because there is a selective advantage to not being red. So the result is a change in allele frequencies over time and an increase in average fitness over time. So in the first generation, we have the frequency of the R allele as 0.5 and the frequency of the W allele as 0.5. This is because 10 of the 20 alleles are the R allele, and that of course equals 0.5. And similarly, 10 of the 20 alleles are the W allele. And we can simply count those up. We know there's 2 alleles for each individual plant, so there's a total of 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20 alleles. And if we counted all the R alleles, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So in this next generation, if the red flowers are half as likely to be pollinated, we end up seeing a shift in the allele frequencies, with the R allele now being 0.45 and the W allele being 0.55. So each of these alleles in this example is then represented by either the letter P or the letter Q. If we go to the next generation and still the red flowers are half as likely to be pollinated, we get another shift in allele frequencies, with the frequency of the R allele, represented by the letter P, being 0.35, and the frequency of the W allele, represented by the letter Q, as being 0.65.